President, I rise to make a contribution on behalf of the Liberals and Nationals on this COVID Omnibus Bill. It has become a bill that has become an icon in a negative way. It has become a bill of great notoriety across the state. And I saw a bus outside, an omnibus as it was called, out the front as local people, community members protest at the shocking bill that has been presented to the parliament. And we still have the same bill now that was presented in the Assembly and passed blithely by the Assembly. The members in the Assembly who ticked off like lemmings, like sheep, on the damaging provisions in that bill. And I'm going to detail these damaging provisions as I go forward. There was no SARC report before the Assembly looked at this. We have an inadequate SARC report presented today to the chamber, belatedly, an inadequate SARC report that did not detail the terrible damage that this bill would have done in the form that it was presented. And I make the point that thousands of people provided significant submissions to SARC, and it's my information that SARC did not provide the proper weight to those submissions that it should have. But I want to get to what's going on here. Why has look? And I'll start off in a very reasonable and fair-handed way on this. There are aspects of this bill that we agree with. There are aspects that are rolling over that are parts of the decisions that were made earlier that we do not oppose. But there are also the new and extraordinary sections that were proposed by Daniel Andrews in the lower house. And I want to come to some of those sections and deal with those sections and with the proposed amendments, if I can perhaps talk to those foreshadowed amendments that were briefed to the opposition last week. But I say the new section 250 that was proposed to be inserted: the Secretary may appoint the following to be an authorised officer: a person the Secretary considers appropriate for appointment based on the person's skills, attributes, experience, or otherwise. Or otherwise. What on earth does that mean? What on earth does that mean? A person included in a prescribed class of person, including Victoria Police. The so-called purpose was to expand the persons who could be appointed authorised officers to include additional public sector employees, employees of other Australian jurisdictions and individuals with connection to particular communities. Now, I want to say something about each of these. The new provision means also that police officers and PSOs can be appointed as authorised officers without the state of disaster being necessary. I don't have a problem with public servants from other states having a role here. In fact, you know, there's a lot to learn. We know how failed the contact tracing is here in Victoria, and we can see a clear role for New South Wales and other contact tracers coming here to support. But you do ask why we need more and more and more authorised officers. This, I think, is a reflection of a deeper concern that the Premier has, that he needs more and more and more power. And this bill is symptomatic of the ongoing attempts by Daniel Andrews, and him specifically I'm talking about. His attitudes, his arrogance is an attempt to grab power and impose his will on the Victorian people in the most demonstrable and the most upsetting ways. Public health doesn't work best with hard penalties. It works best where it's explained and where people work together, and it works better when there is actually a proper base of evidence and the evidence is supplied. And that is not what is occurring in Victoria now. In Victoria now, we have an arrogant Premier, and we've heard increasingly through the hotel quarantine inquiry and increasingly from sources like Jenny Mikakis, who used to just sit over there, was the Health Minister until recently. And she made it clear that all power is being centralised in the Premier's office, Him and his secretary have had enormous power to impose on other ministers. The Gang of Eight operating as a little quango. And I make the point here, there is not one member of the Gang of Eight in the ministerial lineup in this chamber. So this chamber, half the legislature has been cut out of the Gang of Eight, cut out of the powerful Gang of Eight that is running Victoria at the direction of Daniel Andrews, at the direction until hours ago, really, of the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet. And you know, when the COVID pandemic got going, and Chris Eccles and Daniel Andrews decided they were going to reorganise the public service. They decided they were going to reorganise the public service. They organised these missions across departments. They decided that there'd be lead secretaries. In the case of the Department of Health and Human Services, Kim Peake, and she was sent a letter and she was told she didn't answer to the Health Minister anymore. She answered directly to Daniel Andrews on the health emergency. You answer to him. That's what she was told. You answer directly to him. A letter from him. I've seen that letter. It's in the public domain now. If people doubt it, they can go and find it themselves and they will understand the dictatorial power that he is now taking. Cabinet government has broken down in this state. We don't have proper cabinet government in Victoria anymore. We have an arrogant man who is dictating to the COVID cabinet, dictating to the rest of cabinet, dictating to the public service. It is one man drunk on power, one man drunk on pushing people around, and that is what he's doing. We know the way it is operating now, and we hear reports. We all hear reports out of the public sector the way this is operating. This arrogant Premier who has taken all power to himself. And now the quarantine inquiry is moving closer and closer to the source of power. It's time the Premier's Chief of Staff, his media director and other senior people out of his office attended the inquiry and actually...
This is an omnibus bill. And Mr Davis is talking about the Premier. This is not a no-confidence bill. So if he wants to discuss the provisions of the omnibus bill, happy to hear about that. But otherwise, he should move on to and make a relevant point.
It is an omnibus bill, as the member points out. It is a very broad bill, covers a lot of different areas, including, and I intend to specifically focus on the COVID response, which is a part of this. The bill that's been brought forward by the Premier in the other place, brought to this chamber by the Leader of the government in this place, and that lays out new powers, massive new powers.
Thank you. Look, I will just bring to your attention, Mr Davis, what you just said is the omnibus bill, but please concentrate on the bill. Thank you very much.
The Premier has sought to take to himself these powers to appoint authorised officers through the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, who, as we've heard, answers directly to him. He's written to her and he said, on this health response, you answer directly to me. That's what he said. And I make the point here that the government is seeking in this bill, as it's presented to the House now, there may be amendments that are proposed shortly, and I will talk about those in a moment too. But what is clear here is that the Premier is seeking to expand the class of persons. He is seeking to give extraordinary new powers. And in section 251, he sought to insert in the Act authorised officers to receive assistance from any person in carrying out their duties in relation to their powers to investigate, eliminate or reduce public health risk. The amendment makes it so that if a police officer is an authorised officer and requests assistance, they do not need to make a request of the Chief Commissioner. So the normal checks and balances are weakened. In section 252, which is in the bill that we see before us now, to be inserted in the Act will put additional emergency powers under the state of emergency to detain high-risk people. These are extraordinary powers. If a designated authorised officer believes that a person is likely to refuse or fail to comply with a direction, believes that they may fail to comply with a direction. A high-risk person is defined as a person who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 and has not been given clearance from self-isolation. A close contact of a person who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 and has not been given clearance from self-quarantine. A detention period may extend as long as the designated authorised officer reasonably believes that the person is a high-risk person who is likely to refuse or fail to comply with the direction. Again, extraordinary powers that the Premier has wanted to bring into into action here. And I say, and I'm a former health minister, I actually understand that these things actually, public health is actually a subtle task. It's a subtle task to actually, President, get a system in place to actually have community compliance with the orders and the directions that are required, but to have the community confidence and transparency that's required. I say that all of these orders that have been put in place, the government has refused to put into the public domain the briefings that are required, the material that is required for the public to have confidence in those orders. Why? Why, despite directions from this chamber, why, despite requests from the opposition, why, despite requests in adjournment here, why, despite FOI requests, is the government so determined to refuse to release this basic information? Every one of these orders has a brief behind it, and a copy of that brief, perhaps a diluted one, is provided to the Health Minister. Now, why on earth the government would be so sensitive about the provision of those briefs to the public is beyond me. Because in my view, if they're well-based, if they're scientifically based, if they've gone through the proper processes that are laid out in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, the proportionality tests, the tests that are required to make sure that accountability is provided, there is no reason at all why they should not be in the public domain. And I would go further. I would say the working documents behind those, the scientific studies, the other materials, some perhaps from overseas, some perhaps from interstate, some perhaps locally, that have been relied upon, should also be in the public domain. That would boost confidence, it would boost compliance, it would see the community brought into confidence on these matters. But the government completely and utterly refuses to provide that information. And I say the reason for that is because, and this is certainly the information that is provided to me personally directly by people I know in the Public Health Unit, it is clear that the unit is being routinely bypassed by the Premier's office and DPC, but in particular the Premier's office. They actually have a phrase for this. They say there is a bunker over there. They call it the bunker. This is public health people. Call it the bunker. Over in DPC and the Premier's office, where decisions are made about public health matters, and the Public Health Unit is advised afterwards. They're not consulted before, they're advised afterwards, and then directed to sign the public health orders. So there is real reticence, there is real concern in the Public Health Unit. I know some of the people there, and there are people there of great integrity and great skill. And I'll put on record here today that Professor Sutton is probably not at the top of that list. I don't believe he is a person with the deeper qualification that you would need in a very high-quality Chief Health Officer. Notwithstanding that, I believe he does deserve to be accorded a significant respect, because he is actually a person exercising statutory decisions. Now, you know, he could himself choose to publish each and every one of those briefing papers that he has relied on. He could choose to publish the working papers and materials behind each of the orders. He has chosen not to do that. And in fact, he's chosen, along with the Department of Health and Human Services, to dig in and refuse to release that information. So we're now, and I'll put this in the public domain as well, we're now well advanced at VCAT in seeking many of the background documents and the exchanges between the former Health Minister who used to sit there, Professor Sutton, the Premier's office. The first tranche of those documents has now been released to us, heavily redacted, I might add, and that will become a point of dispute at VCAT, and there's a formal hearing date for that dispute. And the second tranche of those documents that we've sought, again, bitterly fought every step of the way by Professor Sutton, the Secretary of the Department, the Minister and the Premier. You've got to ask why are they so resistant about providing these basic pieces of information? Well, you think it's muckraking to know the basis on which those orders are made. You think it's muckraking to see the science behind them. You think it's muckraking, do you, to see, Ms Taylor, you think it's muckraking to see the working documents behind each and every one of those decisions. You think it's muckraking when they put a ring around Melbourne and where is that put and what are the decisions about the different locations? You think it's muckraking that communities should know that information? You think it's muckraking that when masks are initially given in one form and that's ticked but they've changed the form of mask, why is that information that is the basis of that not in the public domain, Ms Taylor? I say to you, you should be supporting the release of this information because the community is entitled to it. The community has been locked down. Where does the 5K decision come from? Who would know where that has come from, other than out of the Premier's office? It was not out of the Public Health Unit. It's a bit like the curfew. The curfew was not out of Professor Sutton, and it wasn't out of the Police Commissioner. Now that leaves a very small band of people who decided that they would put a curfew on to all Victorians. I mean, these are draconian steps to take without proper background and without proper science and without proper information. I say that the Public Health and Wellbeing Act is in many ways a well-constructed act. It does require those decisions to be balanced. It requires a focus on proportionality. It requires a focus indeed on transparency and accountability. And I urge you, Ms Taylor, to go and read the objectives of the Act, and you will be informed about what is behind it. But they are being routinely ignored, routinely blocked by the decisions of the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Premier and Cabinet. So I say this is a case study. This is a case study in how not to run a pandemic, how to lose community confidence, how to behave badly in a way that means community confidence is diminished. And I think the lying, let's call it for what it is, the absolute lying that's occurred at the hotel quarantine inquiry, where people suddenly have this outbreak of amnesia, extraordinary amnesia, and you know, we've seen not only Mr Eccles caught out, but others will undoubtedly be caught out before this process has ended. And you know, none of this builds confidence. None of this is a case study in how to run a pandemic. None of this is a case study in how the best community health outcomes can be achieved. We are concerned, and I draw the attention of the chamber to that clause 15, and we think that this will mean more powers under the workplace arrangements. The occupational health and safety arrangements and WorkSafe inspectors are already provided with enormous powers. The interrelationship between clause 15 and 16 will provide that extra layer of powers so that OHS inspectors will become also authorised officers under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. It is a very powerful act. It has enormous powers there already, and this provides even more powers for those officers. And you have to ask yourself the question: what on earth is the government trying to achieve with this? You've already got these incredibly powerful inspectors. You're now going to arm them up. It's like the man or woman who's the inspector has already got one bazooka. And this bill gives them a second bazooka when they go into the small business. So they're double armed with massive bazookas so that they can hit harder in some way. Really, what is going on here? What on earth is the government so desperate to add these powers for? And I say, again, it's massive overreach. I'm indebted to the Housing Industry Association and Fiona Neild and some of her executive have provided significant information about concerns that they have. And I think their concerns are legitimately outlined in the correspondence that I've received from them. They don't see the need for this multiple layering of additional powers, and nor do many of the other small business organisations. I think Becky is concerned. Other small business organisations are also concerned. Why You know, massive powers. Now, you know, an authorised officer, an OHS, a WorkSafe inspector, goes into a small business somewhere. If there is a clustering in a room that is too tight, too close for COVID-19 purposes, that is already a workplace matter, and they can already take action as required. Now, you know, why do you need to double arm these inspectors? What is that? I have not heard a satisfactory explanation. At the briefing we didn't hear a satisfactory explanation, and I don't think there is one. I think it is, yet again, another significant overreach. So the issues with high-risk persons have been well discussed in the public domain. The government is stepping back from some of those extreme measures that were in the form of the bill. It was passed by the lemmings in the lower house, the government lemmings that ticked it off without proper scrutiny before SARC had even seen it. And I again make the point that this practice that is occurring with SARC now, where they're routinely ticking bills through before they've or routinely failing, I should say, to examine a bill before it's looked at in the chamber, and I do think that this is an increasing problem. The government could have provided those bills earlier, and in my view should have provided those bills much earlier. I also want to draw the chamber's attention to some of the aspects that we will seek to amend, and I want to see if we can circulate. The amendment is not yet ready. Well, maybe I'll talk to it. It can't be terribly far, can it? Either way, I'll talk to it in a very simple mode. It seeks to insert a new clause 16A and 16B. It will follow that the other clause that we're still very concerned about, that adds more powers for authorised officers, and we will seek to deal with the 5-kilometre radius rule that has been put in regulation, in subordinate legislation, and in that mode it will reach down and, through a legislative instrument, revoke the powers that have been put into that particular order. And it will seek to make sure that it's not remade. And Mr Borman might remember in this chamber, I know you were here last time, we saw one bill that, or one disallowance motion that occurred where the government remade the rules the next day. So we've made it clear that that can't occur in this occasion. So that's in two parts. The first part is to simply disallow or to make sure that the 5K rule has no effect, and then the second is to make sure that it can't be easily remade to subvert the decision of the chamber. The point I make here is that there has never been any evidence presented in the public domain that supports the 5-kilometre rule. And still 30 minutes away. Well, I'll seek leave for the House to circulate that when it arrives, Clerk, if with the House's approval. It was prepared late yesterday, and it was due to be here a little earlier than that, and so either way it will be here in good time, and I'm happy at the time of the committee to talk further about the amendment. But the amendment is actually, and I'm indebted to Parliamentary Counsel and put on record my significant appreciation, and you know, I said to the Clerk the other day, the Parliamentary Counsel in Victoria is first rate. Their ability to turn things around quickly is remarkable. Their attention to detail is extraordinary. And their preparedness to think laterally about how to achieve particular objectives, I also put on record as absolutely first rate. And that has not always been the case, I might add, Acting President. It's not always been the case in Victoria, but it is currently. and I think credit should be given where it is due. What I wanted to say, though, about the 5K rule is that it unnecessarily restricts the ability of people to move, and it does it in a way that is not focused on density. It is not focused on the clustering that is the key transmission aspect that people understand with COVID-19. It is focused simply on movement. The decision of the Premier the other day to change the rule and to allow 5Ks within home or 5Ks within work gives, again, the lie to the basis of this. It is entirely arbitrary, these decisions. Why 5Ks? Why not 2Ks? Why not 10Ks? Nobody has ever explained the basis for that 5K set of decisions adequately, and nobody has ever released, as I say, the background documents, the briefing papers, the working papers on which these decisions are made. I want, Acting President, to make a couple more points in conclusion. The first is that I think the community has significantly tired of the way the government has structured many of these decisions over the recent period. The community is tired of being told from on high that they're somehow responsible. The community is tired of the damage that's being done to our small businesses, and the community wants to see the rational basis for each of the decisions that is made. They want to see the explanations, and they want to understand what will actually help manage the virus and what is unnecessary or excessive restriction, like the 5-kilometre rule, like the curfew, that should never have been put in place in the first instance and should be removed immediately in our view. So the other point I want to make is just return to some points I made earlier on about the structure of government and the decision-making in government. And this bill, I think, is another case study. It's, as I'm informed, has come straight again out of the Premier's office. It is a bill that seeks more powers, and those powers are only in some areas explained. We agree with the better arrangements in the courts and the steps that will enable those to proceed. But we do not agree with the excessive overreach in a number of key parts. So, President or Acting President, with those comments, I say that the opposition will oppose Clause 15. We will oppose Clause 16. We will seek to introduce new clauses which will seek to remove or nullify the effect of the 5-kilometre order that's been made under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. And we express our significant concern at the overreach in this bill, our significant concern that it is again driven by the Premier's grab for power. We saw the State of Emergency Bill, now this bill, all of these being crunched through without the proper scrutiny that they should have had. And, you know, my views on SARC are now well known, but the community, I think, wants to see where great power is exercised. They want to see the checks and balances. It's like the attempt to close down this parliament. The lower house was successfully closed by the government for a very lengthy period. It was only our chamber that continued to sit in a moderated way, and, you know, we're all happy to work with the officials here and with the President to find ways to make sure that it's a COVID-safe sitting. But where great power is being exercised, there's great responsibility to put checks and balances in place to make sure that the great power is held in check. And we think this bill is a step too far by the Premier.
Thank you, Mr Davis.